What is going on, you guys? I am back again with another great film, and today's movie opens with Agent Banks and Tevis leading an FBI task force as they raid a house determined to secure an object referred to as a pod. The tension is palpable as the agents storm the house, their training and expertise evident in their synchronized movements and focused expressions. Banks emphasizes the importance of securing the pod and the potential consequences if it falls into the wrong hands. In the garage, Will, confined to a wheelchair, is engrossed in painting a portrait of his deceased daughter. Suddenly, a jar of paint slips from his grasp, shattering on the floor. Will calls out for Teresa, his sister, to help him clean up the mess. He apologizes for potentially disturbing her, but she reassures him that she often stays up late reading whenever Brent, her husband, is out with his friends. Meanwhile, Brent and his friends are gathered at the back of his truck, enjoying cheap beer and sharing stories. John, one of Brent's closest friends, excitedly talks about a girl he's interested in and attempts to show them a photo on his phone. But the reception was poor and the image fails to load. John stands up hoping to get a better signal, and at that moment there's a blazing meteor that streaks across the night sky and crashes to a nearby forest. The ground trembles and the group of friends quickly jump into Brent's car and follow the smoke to the crash site. As they arrive at the crash site, they are met with a scene of chaos. The object that crashed is still engulfed in flames, casting an eerie glow on the surrounding area. They decide to pour ice water on the pod. However, as the water contacts with the pod, a piercing noise reverberates through the air, causing them to recoil in fear and regret their impulsive decisions. Realizing the potential danger of the situation, the boys carefully transport the pod back to the safety of the garage. Will and Teresa, bewildered by the events unfolding before them, seek an explanation from the group, and their friends recount their encounter with the crashed object, sharing their theories and speculations. Will, ever cautious, expresses his concerns about the potential risks of the pod. However, they all agree that they need to understand what they're dealing with before involving the cops, and they decide to take turns keeping watch over the pod. Will volunteers to take the first watch, and an argument ensues between Will and Marcus mocks Will for living in his sister's garage and spending his days immersed in art and not moving on with his life. Meanwhile, Agent Tevis contacts Banks, delivering urgent news of another pod landing. Banks, initially skeptical, seeks reassurance from Tevis that it's not just some elaborate prank. Tevis assures him that she's not kidding and tells him to meet her in Georgia, where the second pod had just been discovered. In the midst of the night, Will awakens from a vivid nightmare, his heart pounding in his chest. As he gathers his thoughts, he notices a peculiar change in the pod. It's become magnetized, attracting small metal objects around the room. Fascinated and slightly unnerved, he observes as the pod opens, revealing a tentacle-like appendage that attaches itself to the back of his neck. In an instant, a surge of energy courses through his body, and to his astonishment, he regains the use of his legs. The commotion in the garage catches the attention of Brent and the others, who all rush over to the garage. Brent, acting on instinct, pulls the tentacle off Will's neck, causing him to collapse on the ground. Marcus and John quickly come to Will's aid, helping him up and guiding him out of the garage and into the safety of the living room. In the living room, Brent, still shaken by the events, turns to John seeking guidance on their next course of action. John suggests reaching out to their old biology teacher, Professor Wesley, who might possess the knowledge and expertise to shed light on the mysterious pod. Determined to find answers, John and Brent leave Will in the care of Teresa and set off to meet Professor Wesley. Meanwhile, Marcus decides to return to the crash site, hoping to find any clues that might be overlooked. Marcus knocks on the door of the farmer where the crash happened, and the farmer tells him that the government was in his backyard an hour ago, and Marcus tells him that they want to see the crash site again, and the farmer takes him back. Marcus sees the hole that was created by the pod was sealed shut, as if nothing happened. Unbeknownst to Marcus, Agent Tevis and Banks have been monitoring his activities closely. They observe as Marcus investigates the crash site and takes photographs, considering him a potential lead to track down the pod. After a lengthy and intense discussion, John and Brent manage to convince Professor Wesley, and he agrees to help them get answers. He then takes down their address, promising to visit them soon. Back at home, Will and Teresa find themselves engaged in a heated argument. Will, determined to explore the extent of the pod's abilities, tries to persuade Teresa to take him downstairs. After a long argument, Will realizes his sister will not relent, so he tricks her into preparing a bath for him and drags himself back to the garage as she was away distracted. He locks the door behind him, and Teresa notices what was happening and runs downstairs, and she tries to open the door, but it was too late. A few minutes later, Will comes out of the garage, assuring her that the pod poses no harm to them, and as Will stands there, one of the tentacles from the pod latches onto Teresa's hand, triggering a flood of memories from her past. Brent comes back and sees what was happening, and he gets angry and tries to punch Will. The pod makes the same noise it did earlier and incapacitates Brent, but stops when Will tells it to. The pod then starts to glow and enlarges. Teresa tells Brent and the guys about the flash and says that she actually felt better, feeling unburdened after it touched her. Will tries to convince the others to let the pod touch them, but Marcus tells them that he wants no part of this and heads home. When he finally gets home, he finds Agent Banks and Tevis sitting in his living room waiting for him. They start to question Marcus, who insists that he doesn't know anything and tells them to leave his house. Will shows the pod one painting of his daughter in the woods and tells it that it was one of his favorite spots. The pod takes him back to the fond memory when his wife and he were together and when their daughter was still alive. Will is overwhelmed with emotion when he sees what he had lost, but before he can calm down, the guys walk in with the professor and Will attempts to gather himself. The professor tells them that he needs to examine the pod as well as all of them, and Will tells the professor that the pod would feel comfortable if he let it bond with him. The professor is reluctant, and Will and Teresa try to assure him that it's okay, but he tells them that it could be doing a number of things to make them think that, but he finally agrees. The pod extends one of its tentacles and bonds with the professor, and his memories flash before his eyes, and the memories are shared with Will, and Will realizes that the professor had cancer. Before Will suggests maybe that there's a way the pod can heal him, the pod detaches itself and grows in size again. Meanwhile, the agents question Marcus, but he tells them that he doesn't know anything, but Banks continued to pester him with questions, but Agent Tevis suggests that they give him some breathing room and surveil him instead, and Marcus, seeing them outside, calls Brent and asks him to pick him up. And Marcus uses an Uber as a decoy and escapes their grasp. After examining the blood samples of all of them, the professor tells John that there are no pathogens or toxins in their blood and that they're all safe, and John asks the professor if he's afraid of dying and asks what he thinks will happen afterwards, and the professor explains that he thinks of death as a rebirth and as a sort of a metamorphosis. The professor asks John to give him his notebook, and when he goes to the other room to get it, the professor drops on the floor. John rushes the professor to the hospital, and the guys come too, but Will says that he doesn't want to go and stays inside the house. Will calls his ex-wife Jess to the house and tells her that something's up. He also goes on to say that he wants her to see something, and Jess reluctantly agrees to come. Banks and Tevis go to a bar where Marcus is known to frequent and asks the bartender if she's seen them, and after a few minutes of questioning, she gives them information on Brent and they put an APB on Brent's car. Meanwhile, Marcus and Brent meet up and head to the hospital to meet John. Jess tries to call Teresa's phone before going to the house, but Teresa's phone doesn't work, so she decides to go see what's going on. She comes to the garage and asks Will where the rest of the guys are, and he tells her that they're at the hospital taking care of the professor, and they start to talk. The tension and pain from losing their daughter is still there, and she asks why he called her there, and Will gets up from his wheelchair and shows her that he can walk. Jess asks him how that's possible. He then tells her that it's a miracle and goes to show her the pod, and Jess faints. The guys visit the professor in his bed, and they wonder if he was hospitalized by the pod, but the doctor tells them that he's been taking too much medicine. They go in to talk to the professor, and he tells them that he's lived a long life and that he doesn't want to spend his days hospitalized in a bed, and convinces them to let him go back to his house. When Jess wakes up, Will explains that the pod miraculously healed him and enabled him to walk, and he tells her that he thinks that it can fix whatever it was that they lost. But Jess was scared and overwhelmed by everything that was happening and tries to get away, but on her way out, she runs into Teresa, and the guys along with the professor decide to stay. Jess asks Teresa what's going on, and she explains how the pod helped her and Will. The professor then tells them that the pod had been collecting the DNA of everyone it's touched, and Will asks why the pod was doing that, and the professor tells him that he's got a theory that he wants to test. The professor then asks the guys to help him get closer to the pod, and the pod reaches out one of its tentacles and bonds with the professor. Jess asks what it's doing to the professor, but Will explains that it's only helping him, and Will gets the messages from the pod, and he tells them that they need to help it too. Marcus and the others resist, but Teresa tells them that she was afraid to do things all her life, but this is something that they should all be part of, and manages to convince all of them to take a leap of faith, and they all bond with the alien except for Jess. In his last moments, the professor tells them how he's always thought that he'd die alone, and lets them know how lucky he feels to have all of them with him, and then passes away. The professor's body then gets absorbed by the pod, and the pod then grows larger than ever. The pod shows Will visions of his daughter, and tells him that he needs to bond with Jess. At that moment, Agent Banks and Tevis barge in through the garage door, along with a SWAT team, and try to to apprehend everyone. Brent and the guys get into a struggle with the agents, and a gun goes off during the struggle and hits the pod. The pod then responds with the same auditory attack and everyone goes down. The pod lets go of Will and he goes down on the floor, and Will pleads with Jess again and asks her to bond with the pod, and she finally agrees, and the pod shows them visions of how everything transpired. It shows them the crash that made them lose their daughter, and in the intensity of it all, Jess admits that she knows that it's not Will's fault that their daughter died and forgives him. And moments later, the pod gives birth to their daughter. They ask the little girl who she was, and she tells them that she's a product of all of them, and the movie ends as they embrace their newborn daughter. That is it for today's recap. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Make sure to leave a like, leave a comment, most of all, subscribe to my channel. I love you guys so much, and I promise to see you on my next recap. Bye!